Welcome everybody. It's 2 o'clock CET, 3 o'clock South African time, GMT +2. Like any good project management, we'll start on time. My name is Ben Peters. I'm the head for the IPMA Smart Cities Special Interest Group. And welcome to everybody, and thanks for joining our project success webinars, and with the special with regards to the IPMA special interest groups. If you want to ask any questions, please utilize the Q&A function in Zoom. I will give everybody, I will be able to see all the questions. I will be able to see those answers, as well as our guest speaker, Jon Williams. And when Jon is completed with his presentation and with his discussion, I will open up the floor, and then we will address all the questions and answers accordingly. We will keep the webinar open for 60 minutes, and then to make sure that if there's anything else to further discuss, that we are available to do those discussions accordingly. So what is the special interest group? So the IPMA special interest groups is focusing on specific areas that benefit our career, our work, and the planet. And our SIG members strive to advance the industry to create new standards, networks with the industry leaders and peers to find opportunities and grow more, with special focus on project, program, portfolio management, and the interest of those that is attending today. We've got multiple global SIGs from IPMA. We've got the artificial intelligence. We've got a special interest group for healthcare, a special interest group for innovation and change, mega projects, this particular one for smarter cities, smarter rural, as well as smarter you. And for more detail, please visit sig.ipma.world. And if you want to get more involved, please follow the link. Please let me know if there's anything you would like to know more. There's a lot of places where you can contact and get in detail with us, and you are more than welcome to just engage with us should there be anything that you would like to understand from a SIG perspective. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce to you Jon Williams. Jon has been working in the public sector with great focus on leadership and management offerings for future city solutions to clients across Africa. He's been involved in the development of successful African cities, and that holds the key to success of especially the African continent. These solutions focus on the solving of complex problems and building of trust. And then previously, he's been the Deputy Finance Director, London Borough of Lambeth in the UK. Jon will take us through and discuss future cities as his topic. And as an abstract is the question in our minds is, how does future cities look like? Taking consideration of shocks and stresses we currently experiencing, taking also in being mindful of specific things happening with us currently with regards to COVID-19. We know that we all aim to implement various technologies to ease the management of daily lives within cities. We all are wondering what the future holds. What does the future of cities look like? What impact will the current COVID-19 have on cities to ensure livable, workable, and sustainable cities for all to benefit? Jon, thank you very much. Thanks for joining. We're really looking forward to hear you talk today, and I'll give you, you can get going.
Ben, thanks very much. I'll share my screen. Thanks very much. Well, listen, Ben, Rebecca, and the rest of the IPMA structures, a massive privilege for me to be with you today. So a real opportunity to say thank you before I get started in terms of the opportunity to address you. And indeed, what an extended privilege to be talking to this SIG for Smarter Cities. I tend to describe when people ask me within PwC or when I'm talking to clients in different parts of Africa, and I also hold a sort of international development hat for Africa for PwC, I say I've got the coolest job in PwC. PwC's purpose around building trust and solving complex problems is perhaps best resonated in exactly this space. And Ben, I think that chimes really nicely with how you introduced this expectation around cities of the future, indeed how they're operating today and what the plausible path forward for the future really looks like. So a real pleasure to be with you today. I think let me just start by saying I fundamentally believe that cities across our continent play a fundamentally important role in the future success or otherwise of our continent. I think it's very clear that actually how policy and the space around policy through different tiers of government in different parts of the continent, how those things filter down and how they arrive and how they impact place, and place is cities, means that cities in some way, shape or form, whether that's through urbanization, whether it's through financing vehicles, whether it's whatever those things might be, the concept of place and the concept of place today and for the future around intergenerational sort of fairness, building back better, all of those concepts are fundamentally important to the direction of travel for cities. So let me start by saying I think cities are fundamentally important in terms of the future of our continent. If I reflect and bring that closer to home, our sort of three major cities within South Africa constitute approximately 87% of our GDP for a country. So, they really are the hotbed of where economic activity happens, where urban activity happens, and indeed where social activities happen. Let me also confess now, and I'm sure we can have some questions about it, I'm not a big fan of the concept called smart cities. I do tend to think about future cities rather than smart cities. And let me just quickly sort of elaborate as to why. I think it's very clear, and you're absolutely spot on. New technologies play a fundamentally important part and a directional part in terms of where cities are moving towards, and indeed describe the relationship that cities and customers, be those businesses or individual residents within the city, new technologies play a fundamentally important role. As I've dealt with African cities, I guess what I've really come to terms with is a sense that actually when people talk about smart cities, it tends to convey a sense of plugging things in and getting a better outcome. And I think my observations would say there's different versions of smart cities in different places. Actually helping some cities to get their accounting right might be a version of smart because it talks to financial sustainability, maybe even viability given the stresses around global finances. So I tend to talk about future cities and the future of future cities. So I hope kind of people recognize the nuance of what I've just described. So today's presentation, I'm asking myself and thinking very kind of critically right at this point in time. This is an ever-changing environment. So you've kind of caught me a bit on the hop. I've not had sort of 12 presentations that I just go, oh, I'll take a bit of that and I'll take a bit of that. I've actually almost gone back to the drawing board to really think harder about this role of what future cities should be focused on right now. And I think that the simplest way that I get to it, and I'll try and describe through the presentation why I think about it in this way, and indeed what I think the kind of constituent parts of that stress environment are. Finance I've already given away. I also kind of just want to be clear. You know, I think there's a real journey towards needing to understand what a city as an organization means to a larger city, and the extent to which we start to think about system-based approaches to drive resilient place-based outcomes. Now, that's a real mouthful, but I hope what I'll demonstrate through the course of this discussion is actually the opportunity to think about resilient outcomes in a place. I'm sat in the city of Cape Town at the moment. What do resilient outcomes for the city of Cape Town look like if I were going to challenge that very strategically on economic levers? What does economic rebuild look like in the city of Cape Town? And I think we test the word better, resilience, if we're thinking about system-based outcomes and how all of these different things work together, rather than actually just turning around as a resident, as a person who works in and contributes to the city's economy. I think we should be opening our gaze into realizing the potential of system-based outcomes. And I've also, recognizing I'm clearly talking to the IPMA group, I also have a few thoughts around project management and the role of project management into the future of future cities, and this challenge around sort of my version. I'm not an expert project manager, but you know, from my perspective, perhaps a definition, a little bit of thinking around smart project management. Before I get started, colleagues, the reason why I said it's a fundamentally important time in the evolution of cities, I think speaks to a layer of three things, and it'll become obvious as I turn the pages. But I think global circumstances, national circumstances, and local circumstances have never been quite in such a state of flux. And within a state of flux, you have risk, you have opportunity, and you have a city locally that's trying to make sense of and understand how it's impacted by, you know, national finances translating into how they support it financially, but actually the extent to which the city of Cape Town will speak very openly and beautifully about being a competitive city. So that's a quid pro quo. You've got a debit and credit relationship there, and you need to understand it in exactly that way. So let me jump in. Clearly, our global fundamentals are absolutely shaken at the moment. I think that's the best way to describe it. If I look at the source of the IMF, we've got two diagrams down at the bottom of this slide that demonstrate the extent to which they anticipate real GDP growth over the course of the year. And critically, what it's describing are figures, can you believe, of -70 to -15%. If I reflect and look across Africa, it's a bit of a mixed bag. But if I reflect on Southern Africa and sort of almost sub-Saharan Africa, we sit in that space of -15 to -5%. And I guess what I draw out here is not just the exemplification that economics is about GDP, jobs, and fiscal revenues. I guess what I'm describing is the extent to which economics plus national finances and global finances sit very deeply intertwined. If you haven't got the right finances, it's very difficult to catalyze economy. If you haven't got the right economy, are you generating future taxpayers and building employment, etc.? And I think it's absolutely fair to say that our global picture shows real decline, real contraction, and real difficulty on both sides of that coin. Global fundamentals around economics and global financial global fiscal, the global fiscal position is incredibly constrained. I think that's evident as it relates to paying for the health pandemic. I think we have devastated economies, all relative to their starting position, clearly. And actually, very interestingly, if you do read more broadly in this space, I think they speak to literally devastated economies across high income, middle income, etc., save for China. So very interesting to understand what that means in terms of, almost that, I don't really like the term, but those big geopolitical trends. Really understanding sort of the US elections and how they use new fora to sort of create new influence or re-establish influence. Brexit, these grand strategies like the EU's green COVID recovery, like globalization and urbanization. I think this is going to catalyze more of that. Good or bad, I think it's going to catalyze more of that. I think on the right-hand side at the bottom of the page, I really want to draw your attention to a comparison that we've made around these middle-income countries, looking at 2019 versus 2020 yearly unemployment rate change. And devastatingly, South Africa sits right on the top of that pile. It's almost an outlier in that view. When you see it, at 28.7% to 32.5%. And clearly, as a lot would know, that actually sitting within that is this fundamental challenge around youth unemployment, which sits in the 50+% figures. So, the fundamentals, and it's a strong word, but it's an important word, our global fundamentals, and how we realize them more locally, our global fundamentals are in a tough space. On the right-hand side, you see this point around ESG, and it's really important to recognize that a lot of these big directional theme changes that are globally important because they deserve to be, but also because they have been announced and kind of got announced and have got this momentum, and almost then the pandemic came, means that actually we can't just stop. The planet won't wait. Whilst emissions are projected to be 7% lower in 2020 to 2019, we still need to do more in that global space to drive change. We're more resilient when we're working together. All of these kind of critical points around partnership, policy, and how that kind of culminates in that global framework around bringing about change and helping to steer change. Adversity spurs innovation. I love it, and I think we see it, whether you're describing individual organizations pivoting or whether you're describing a time of crisis. And Ben very clearly said at the start, this point around stress management. Digital is the way, I think, speaks for itself. And then this point around leaders must be bold and transparent. And I hope what you'll hear me do at the end and throughout is to talk about what I believe is one of the most critical. We're at the critical juncture around leadership boldness, culture boldness, and partnership building. So, colleagues, I think the point here is the extent to which global fundamentals are in a poor state, underlined by the relationship between global economics and global finances. Moving on, I said I'm going to try and describe almost the extent to which we're on a burning platform as it relates to cities. And remember, cities as it relates to my sense of, actually, if we're going to move the needle in Africa, cities plays a fundamentally important part. So our national fundamentals, and I talk from a South African perspective. A couple of years ago, I might have been able to do this from a UK perspective, and perhaps I could point at a few things that are of interest from a UK perspective, given I spent 20 years in government in the UK. But the extent to which we have this divided economy in a South African sort of perspective, where we have within the foundational layers of a poor economy, inequality and poverty as fundamental inhibitors to growth. We've had stagnant growth for a very long time, and the extent to which that stagnancy is now impacted by the pandemic means that actually our economy is in incredibly poor stage. You will see at the bottom, you will see debt as a proportion of GDP. Really interestingly, if you actually look at our national finances, paying the credit card for the country is the third largest area of payment that sits within our kind of commitments as a country. So the extent to which we're living beyond our means, I think, speaks directly to that. Our budget balance describes that we're also clinically a country that doesn't save. We don't save in our homes and in our stands. So the extent to which our fundamentals, right down from national into literally people at home, means that I think we're in really tough times. PwC has been doing a lot of work with national government around what our rebound might look like in terms of pure economics, sector rebound, capability, joblessness and GDP and all of those sorts of things. And part of that is an experiment to determine upside scenarios, baseline scenarios, and downside scenarios. And even in our most ambitious upside scenario, we're saying that effectively to return unemployment to the rate that it was pre-COVID, in the most optimistic of ways, is a 10+ year journey. So we're in it for the long haul. And the relationship, as I say, between economics and finances, I think it's pretty clear that we live beyond our means and we don't have the fiscal resources nationally to solve these problems easily. And this doesn't exclude places like the UK. The UK are delivering and spending, and borrowing more than sort of 25, I think it's 28% of their GDP in 1 year to repay. But they've got economic fundamentals that make that a robust choice. So whilst I might have sort of picked up on some issues on the left-hand side of this slide, I sort of, that's my thought, and I could go on. Economic recovery and reconstruction, job creation, education, health, rural development, anti-corruption and land reform. All of these are they're wicked problems at a national level. And the extent to which all of those play out in place, I think describes the extent to which that economic and fiscal sort of constraint means that, cities are really, really at the sharp end. And it's why I went back almost to the drawing board around understanding what I wanted to kind of chat to you guys about today. So my final piece obviously then just comes back to this challenge around city fundamentals. And what I have here is perhaps the articulation of what I mean by the funnel and the sharp end, almost the apex. Because I think for the very first time, it's now cities that are contemplating and managing business as usual. And remember, with all of these things that are happening around urbanization, the impact that pandemic has had on homelessness, all of these business as usual issues are really complex. Business as usual is not the same business as usual as a few years ago. Transport systems are kind of raising their own complexities. Health clearly stands out as it relates to today's sort of issues around COVID and the pandemic. What I highlight below that is the extent to which actually you move from business as usual, which is tough, into a space that says, actually, there is this stress-based management where we're dealing. The city of Cape Town announced a day zero and managed splendidly to avoid that. But we have got COVID. We're now moving into thinking through vaccines. We have got protests. We have got this fundamental point around fire. We have got the ever-present damaging load shedding. These stress-based events require a different form of leadership, a different form of problem solving, and are externally generated to the extent that they might be natural, like a drought, might be because of collapse, be that load shedding, for example. So not fundamentally of the city's making, but because it funnels down into this place called the city of Cape Town, the city deal with these issues. So what we have is business as usual that is tougher than it's ever been, with an increase in social demand for services because of the pandemic and the rates of urbanization. On top of that, you've got stress-based management. And if I were to reflect back on my own city, the city of Cape Town, what they've done fabulously is manage the criticality of business as usual. They've also managed the stress-based challenges incredibly well, and are now, globally recognized across public and private sector for their project management approach to dealing with business as usual issues as much as with stress-based management issues. So what I have underneath of each of those is financial management and financial affordability. And I've changed the words, as you can see, from financial management to financial affordability, because I think the nature of the examination on cities is fundamentally changing around around the finances that secure their future direction. If you're managing an entire system and it is business as usual, you understand your public financial management stresses from start to finish. You can budget and you can close your accounts. That's called financial management, and you report on monthly cycles. When stress-based management activities occur, it's now about financial affordability. What is that going to cost us? How do we fit that into the envelope? And what does it mean to all of those other things that are business as usual? You've not got tons more money. So how is it that you now start to manage a system which is under stress around financial affordability, not around financial management? What are you turning off? What are you saying no to? And already what you're starting to find is a circular relationship where actually decisions that are made in stress-based systems mean they have a fundamental impact back into business as usual. Because you have to respond to a drought means that you need to turn something off. There's only a certain amount of financial resource. I think where I really want to kind of just drift into very quickly is, I think there's now a third category, and this is why I talk about system-based approaches to place-based outcomes. I think we now are talking about the diagram on the right-hand side, and perhaps it's even more complex, but I've tried to sort of simplify it that says, actually, cities now need to be building competencies that can talk to financial resilience, not financial affordability, not financial management, but actually challenges around, are we a viable institution into the future as individual household incomes are falling? We see our tax base in South Africa from a national perspective falling, and provincial availability around finances being constrained. So the system's under stress. So I think we're genuinely, colleagues, in a position around challenging financial viability. And the corollary of that, the inverse of that, is how, through system-based thinking, do you define financial resilience? And I think somewhere in there, if you were asking me as Jon and PwC, is how you think about functional assignment. Who does what in the system? The two chunks, economic recovery and infrastructure recovery, I think are fundamental. Cities don't own lots of economic levers. So to what extent can they reach into understanding how they invest in their place? Billions of rands in South Africa in each of our big cities are invested every single year into place. How do they catalyze infrastructure that generates economic return? So I'm talking now carefully about, yes, you invest in social infrastructure, but actually, are there ways that you can create economic outcomes, and are there ways that you can create new forms of revenue returning infrastructure that start to pay back over time that sense of social, but also recognizing the changing nature of city-based recovery. Economic recovery speaks to itself. What I want to point out at a local level is the power and the potential of putting economic outcomes together with financial outcomes. And a piece of work that the city commissioned recently has delivered some wonderful insights at doing exactly this. We've done credit-based modeling for the very first time in the public sector. That's usually the preserve of big banks and insurers, to really understand what what does tourism really mean in a place like the city of Cape Town? And is tourism a fundamentally dominant part of how the city of Cape Town generate revenues? And therefore, if you're going to kind of create any form of incentive framework, where, if the city of Cape Town had an extra 10 Rand, where would it seek to invest? Would it seek to invest in the economic cluster around sector growth that creates the multiplier effects and generates finance? And or does it invest in, in thinking about plowing more into infrastructure or into stress-based management, etc.? So the relationship between finance, economics, and infrastructure, I think, are going to be crucial to the economic success and the directional success of our continent, and particularly our big cities in South Africa. Spatial equality, social equality, and green transition, colleagues, I won't dwell on. I think people understand the extent to which building back and creating urban equality, spatial equality, I think is well understood. And I think it's part and parcel of the paradigm, the challenges that sit within infrastructure recovery. Building back equally is, in terms of social sort of responsibility, I think is a wonderful opportunity, but is incredibly challenging over the course of reconstituting a history. So that sort of the just transition in that space, I think, is fundamental. And then remember, I started on slide 1 around that sort of ESG. The world can't wait. So part and parcel of all of this is investing in new types of innovation, new types of structures that perhaps aren't that affordable just yet. So that green transition is one that comes with a lot of thought and consideration around how you go through this paradigm of a just transition. Really interestingly, if you listen to our president and his announcement of the State of the Nation, he spoke about just transition at one page, and he was talking about social equality, urban equality, spatial equality, land-based equality, etc. But also, sort of 3 or 4 pages further on, spoke about coal-fired power stations. So how we find a narrative and how that narrative becomes pervasive in a system, I think, is important. But colleagues, the point is that cities are now not at a position that they can only go, thank goodness I'm dealing with business as usual. That day is long past. They are almost starting to kind of get a bit of a rhythm around stress-based management. And certainly is evident with all of the expertise that I see at the City of Cape Town. But also now starting to think about how do they respond to building for recovery. And for me, that is system-based mentality. It has to be a system-based mentality and must include content. I just want to spend, I think I've got 1 slide after this, so you'll bear with me. But effectively what I'm proposing here is what I think this system perhaps looks like. And it's not as simple as this. I can't capture a system on a slide, but understanding the city, the state, the people, the place, and the world is, I think, actually the city boundary. And I would articulate it like this: the city want to be a competitive city in the City of Cape Town, but they don't own the tariff barriers at the port in the City of Cape Town. So competitiveness is by its very nature inhibited because of the relationships between the city and the nature of the powers and mandates that are vested in other forms of the state. So I describe the state. It could be national, provincial government, it could be national institutions like courts, and it could be state-owned entities. People, individuals, companies, thinking more broadly, more deeply about forming partnerships with NGOs, academia, media even, investors, local investors. I'll come back to investors in terms of FDI further down, but investors, how do you find space for them as part of the system? The place, natural assets, geography, resources, the cultures and histories where innovation is happening in place. And then obviously economic development, the world, investors, tourism, foreign direct investment. Fascinating how alongside all of this is international development now, and how they invest from other parts of the globe in this place called Africa, has stopped calling it, grant funding or aid. It is now trade and investment. We will invest. This is what we expect as a return. So that's certainly an examination from others into our place. And what I try to kind of capture on the right-hand side, sort of perhaps pretty untidily, is this point around these are all of the big capitals that sit within space, transport and infrastructure in this place, within the city boundaries. How do we utilize public sector, city-based assets? How do we utilize, other assets that sit within the public sector, the state, national assets, provincial assets? How do we understand kind of individual assets? How do all of those things happen, and how do we deliver these types of capitals within these city boundaries? And I guess the biggest challenge is this little throwaway line underneath that says, despite a lack of control, citizens expect city governments to deliver these outcomes. So understand, colleagues, I think as we transition from business as usual into stress-based management into the future of our cities in place, means I think we need to start thinking much more significantly around system-based outcomes for place-based realities. And I start to sort of describe what I see by that, and the challenge of a place like a city, realizing that it's got a decreasing influence as you get further out into the world. Clearly, that's pretty tough to say that the city of Johannesburg or the city of Durban or the city of Cape Town or Nairobi have a fundamental impact on the world. But how do they create that draw for competitiveness? If I use the same example, for example, I then sort of describe a little bit on the left-hand side our future cities model in PwC, where we place the citizen at the heart and we think around those capabilities that cities need. So intelligence, power, and incentives is our real play towards economics, urban finance. And now remember, colleagues, I'm not talking about revenues and expenditures. I'm actually talking about how do you utilize the public sector balance sheet? How do you enter into capital markets in different ways? How do you encourage kind of different forms of finance? How do you cities find different pockets of funding that might be available elsewhere? It's not just about revenues and expenditures. Why? Because we're talking about system-based outcomes. And I think system-based outcomes needs to be the direction of travel if we're going to be able to talk genuinely on the left-hand sort of, 6 o'clock until 10 o'clock, sustainability and resilience for place. On the right-hand side, I kind of give away what do we think is the urgent starting point. And I hope it's sort of been pretty clear already. It's this point around strengthening partnerships, private sector, NGOs, civil society, and spheres of government, including academia. But actually leadership and culture, I think, and culture-led change, I think, is going to be the absolute buzzword in terms of the future role of city leaders. Can we expect current city leaders to exhibit the skills for business as usual, stress-based management, and building back across a system? And that's not a critique. That is actually, wow, that's a really, really difficult job. And if we are to become successful over time, it actually requires an ability to moderate and manage and lead over that entire spectrum, business as usual, all the way through to kind of economic rebuild for a place where, my children would be able to find jobs and would be contributing taxpayers into the future. And I think this point around enablement, we don't do enough research and development. We don't experiment nearly enough. And legislation and all the rest of it doesn't really help us in terms of being able to experiment, being able to spin off ideas, to be able to think differently and creatively. And I think actually, if I cast my mind back, I think, the UK has been having a very interesting, long-winded debate about decentralization and centralization and the extent to which there's autonomy recognized in place. And I think that has really centered around this point of leadership enablement across the patch. And then the integrated, a culture-led change, recognizing that cities need to go through this evolution of change, shifting their behaviors to be sort of interconnected and moving beyond approaches and silos into, system-based outcomes and system design and system-based thinking and agile and sprint, and all of which I think is a great segue into my last point that says kind of, what do I think this means for project management? And this is my last before I open up for questions is, and you'll see my play between future cities and smart project management. And I'm not talking, measurable and all of those things. I'm actually thinking, as it's described here, we're transforming spaces, and transforming urban space happens through project management. And I think project managers are going to need to deal with, increasing portfolios, increasing levels of programs and therefore projects. And I think the complexity of that portfolio across a system down to, many hundreds and thousands of projects is increasing at an exponential rate. Clearly more stakeholders and competing demands, much more scrutiny, compliance and insights. So from governance, risk and compliance, perhaps traditionally where project management had a real role to play, still does, but seeks for greater insights, all the way through to tests around value for money. Remember the challenge around outcomes for financial resilience, striking that balance between, am I investing in the right place for the right outcomes? Increasingly complex regulations, particularly if we're going to be stretching to place and not location, improving their digital skills, data analysis, analytics, management, security, data protections, knowledge management, data-driven decision-making. I know we all work on those things in our daily life as project managers, but I think the complexity, the detail that sits in that, I think is going to increase. And then my sort of final throwaway is, and of course, some resilience amongst you as individuals. And let's hope we can smile throughout. So colleagues, with that, thanks from me to you, and really happy at this point, Ben, to jump into questions. And should I stop sharing or should I leave it on, Ben?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jon. You're welcome to leave on your presentation. If you want to go back to one or two things before I'll take over again.
Terrific.
And thanks some more for the brilliant presentation and discussing this very important matter with us. Just a couple of comments before I get into the questions is that I think from an IPMA smarter city point of view and your future city work within PwC, I think there's a lot of alignment. IPMA also believes in the fact that it's not just about the smart element, it's about getting smarter as we continue.
Yep.
Further, there's a lot of alignment with regards to the focus on a workable, sustainable, livable environment in cities, and therefore the need for smarter cities. I'm so glad you mentioned and you discussed a couple of things about the resilience outcomes. And I'm going to take the opportunity also to invite our guests today to the discussion and to the IPMA Global Practice Week, where we will have a great focus on resilience as the key topic in the IPMA Global Best Practice Week during the end of April. I would like to start off with the first question from Tim Jakes, and I'm just going to add one or two things to that. And if you can open on your side the questions, you will be able to see them. And he says, thanks for the presentation. And the question that he asked was, what type of projects do you see on the horizon that projects and program managers will need to be ready to take on? And I would like to add on to that to say, to generate that competitive advantage that you talked about, and making sure that you utilize the leadership skills of your project managers to ultimately get there.
Yeah, listen, I think great combination of kind of inputs into a broad question around what types of projects, thinking about competitive advantage and how do you utilize skills. And I think I like the final point of that question very much, because I think we need to give voice to project managers from the perspective of kind of what constitutes, sound project management, because I think that is what should be helping to define the types of projects that cities invest in. I think cities investing, all by themselves without a voice from project managers in this is a good project because it's the right thing to do at the right time for the right amount of money, I think is critically important. So take it as my answer to this is that, utilizing the skills of project managers ought to be around how you plan and think through projects and the creation of projects as much as actually throughout the project life cycle itself. That's kind of your professional skills and capability, but actually your voice in helping to plan and strategize, I think is really important. I recognize, and the reason I say that really importantly is because actually I think in a system you need to synergize. So you need to say, how do we get better project outcomes from a collective bigger bang for our buck? So if the system is bigger than the individual location, what is the role of project managers in really understanding, what can you get as an outcome, whether it's financial returns, social outcomes, whatever those things might be, what can you get as a multiplier with bigger upfront investment? And that might actually fundamentally change what you invest in. And that's why I'm saying, how is it that we get the project managers into that planning stage that says, if we're talking system, wow, we could do some really cool things across the system. And then I think, Ben, I would, one of the filters against which I would measure that choice, that plan, that outcome is to say, where is it that we see competitive advantage? And one of those might be, where you've got revenue returning, the potential to build revenue returning assets, and on things like transport and how you connect transport systems. That remit really fundamentally sits with city and province in South Africa in terms of their mandates. So now that ought not to be just described as we've got a mandate to provide transport, right? So now as the city of Cape Town and other cities think around perhaps the future of rail, for example, what does integrated transport really mean? And do you know what we're talking about, Ben, there is systems-based transport, right? How you get people from wherever they are into their job locations. So system-based sectors have been with us for a long time. I don't think we've scaled that challenge to sector-based outcomes and leadership and management. So Ben, very quickly, utilizing skills, but getting project managers early up into the conversation, because I think it might change the nature of the investment, particularly if you're thinking across skills. Types of projects, I think, would be on matters that are about connectivity, getting people in and to jobs, transport, human settlements, etc. I think really stand out. But how you connect, for example, City of Cape Town, how we work with other spheres of government to get some form of direct transport from Cape Town International into the CBD, for example. So, but actually, if you built a landscape of projects, how do you crowd the private sector in when the public sector are saying, I've got, and I'm talking system public sector, we're putting some skin in the game. And then competitive advantage would be fundamental to the choice of all of that. And you project managers are really great at a distillation of exactly that. You're on mute, Ben.
Apologies for that. Thanks for that, John. Yes, I think just to add a bit is that, we believe that to deliver on a strategy and to deliver on various things, that you need to take a project program portfolio approach. And I think that similarly from a strategic point of view, building that smarter city. We've got a second question, and you mentioned that we are more resilient when we work together. Yep. Mark is saying that he supports this ideal, but it is not something that is achieved very often. And when we are stressed, we tend to focus even more on protecting ourselves. Can you maybe please share examples of when this has occurred, as well as discussing the types of leadership required to promote this ideal?
Yeah, I'll get you back, Mark, in due course, right? Because it's a great question, and you're absolutely spot on. I would challenge the word ideal, right? Because I actually think it's something that we must be striving towards. If we understand business as usual, stress-based management, and the importance of building a future in cities, I think it can't be an ideal. I think that's the premise of my business case that says, actually, it must be functionally what leadership is driving towards, that we deliver functional alignment in place, and functional assignment comes through the extent to which you understand who's best positioned to deliver what type of service. So, but you're absolutely right, Mark. Our experience to date is not, we're not inundated with examples. What I would say, and having been, sort of worked in finance in London all the way through their sort of their recessionary years and the choices that they were making about how they funded local government. London is a small geography that comprises 33 local authorities, and you don't get the London Borough of Lambeth trying to do the same thing as the London Borough of Southwark, or the London Borough of Croydon, or the London Borough of Bexley. Or so there is, there's a synthesis of 33 London boroughs in a really small little geography. I mean, Lambeth was 13 miles long by 2 miles wide. A small geography, highly dense, clearly, but actually we delivered in a way that was uniquely about connections into place, which is called London, and London as a destination for tourists, as a destination for big business, certainly before Brexit and the like. So I think there are models around, we are more resilient, we make better decisions, and we define strong outcomes for place. And perhaps, the whole nature of how London is synthesized is perhaps a good example of that. And it's pretty unique. It's not like New York, for example, or whatever else. They tend to be singularly sort of destined, if you know what I mean. So I think there are examples, Mark, and the leadership that, for me, that sits underneath that is this point around enablement, and actually just being really clear about how do you define leadership, which is about functional assignment. Who's the best placed person and the best placed capability with the requisite amount of kind of budget to define the right types of outcomes? Why is it that we have mixed mandates? And between those mixed mandates, and by the very nature of mixed mandates, we have overlaps and we have gaps. And leadership across overlaps and leadership and gap is always really complex. And I think we waste resources. I think we waste time. All of those things that project managers kind of can't abide, right? So I think what leadership is about is, and this future leadership is about, open-mindedness. It is about enablement. It is about research and development. It is about data and analytics, taking a data-led approach to where do we have overlap? Where do we understand philosophically who delivers perhaps on a social cluster, who delivers on a this type of cluster? Who are the right people and what are the right relationships? So, and it's, Mark, it's exactly why I said about partnerships. It's exactly why I said about enablement, and then leadership enablement, and exactly why I said about a culture for integrated change, because you have to change the system. And if you change something over here, it normally sets off little alarm bells in other places. So what is integrated culture-led change across the patch? But really great question, Mark, and I guess my default would be to the City of London for the outcomes of London, and the leadership being a focus on partnerships, a focus on enabling leaders, and a focus on culture-led change and integrated change across the patch. Thanks.
And then thank you for that, Jon. I think the next question from Oksana Klemenko adds to that, and within IPMA, and this is going to be the last question that I'm going to ask you. I'm just mindful of time, and I just want to conclude after this is that if you can maybe in 2 minutes just tell us what about architecture, and what is the contribution that architects can make to the resilience of the cities, and what kind of competencies are necessary for the architects. And I can confirm that within IPMA there is what they call the individual competence baselines, and we're talking about the leadership and those individual soft skills and the requirements of our individuals. So if you can maybe just respond to Oksana.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ben, and another really good question. And as I say, and it's a really great point, Oksana, because architects fundamentally form part of the system, right? And the system comprises involvement and participation. And I think there's also a question around participation, but we should be encouraging participation. And, you know, so certainly architects form part of a system and should be participating. And I've rolled back to that point here, Oksana, you'll see spatial equality in urban form. You know, the role of designing workable, livable spaces, I think means that actually we need great ideas. We need new innovative ideas. We need to know how space interacts with, you know, land, housing, transport, how all of those things intersect, and how you get livable space, how people enjoy family time, how they've got open space. We've got mixed use development. We're thinking about density, where all of those things, I think, and you know, perhaps even part of the green transition, how we're returning water, how do we get off the grid? All of that, I think, sits really squarely, and I could go on for ages because it's a little bit of a hobby horse of mine. But I think kind of the role of architects in that space and bringing innovation that make it workable, livable, you know, exciting, vibey, all of that, I think, is fundamentally how I would describe. But Oksana sits directly in my space around spatial equality, and I'm talking about system. So I think you play a part in the system, and I think as a player in the system, the onus is on you to contribute to that system and to contribute in a way that is about competence. And that, for me, is clearly in the space around how we design better, more integrated, more socially equal, more accessible public space. Thanks.
Thank you, Jon, and thanks for your time. I'm going to share my screen again, if you can just allow me. Just to conclude. Jon, from my side and from IPMA Special Interest Group for Smarter Cities, thank you very much. Thanks for answering all the questions. So you did address the question from Eunice as well. Just to conclude, if anyone is on the call and you would like to receive CPD points, can I please request that you make sure that your full name and your surname are displayed in Zoom, and not just your email address, so that we can issue you with your CPD record for proof of participation. Further, our next event, and very interesting book club event from the Special Interest Group for Mega Projects. Mega Project Leaders by Natalie Druin, and on the March 24th. And we look forward to see you at that particular event, where we're going to discuss this particular book and what we've learned from this book accordingly. It is almost 4 o'clock South African time. Once again, thank you very much for joining. Thanks for your participation. Have a brilliant day. We will keep this open up to 4 o'clock. Goodbye.